All right, so today we're going to be tackling the flywheel effect. We're going to be diving deep into Jim Collins' Turning the Flywheel. Um, Jim Collins, the guy who wrote the book on great companies, well, literally wrote the book, right?
He did, yes. Yeah.
But here's the cool part. This concept isn't just for, those giant companies, the Fortune 500. It's for everybody.
Right.
Think schools, social movements, even your own personal goals.
Yeah.
We're talking about building unstoppable momentum. That's what this is all about.
Well, I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the flywheel is that it's a strategic compounding machine. So each turn of the wheel builds upon the work that came before it. It's a series of well-executed decisions, all compounding upon each other.
Okay, so you're saying it's not just about doing things well, it's about doing things well in a specific order that builds on itself.
Precisely.
Yep.
And it's not a one-time thing, right? It's about creating a repeating loop that generates its own energy. So think of it like this. It's not just a list of objectives. It's a dynamic sequence that, once it gets going, is really hard to stop.
I'm starting to see how this could apply to way more than just business. But I need an example, something concrete, something I can really sink my teeth into.
All right, let's talk about Amazon. Back during the dot-com bust, everyone was writing them off. But Bezos and his team, they had this flywheel, and they stuck to it. Lower prices, that attracted more customers, which led to more sales. More sales attracted more third-party sellers, and so on. That increased volume drove efficiencies, which allowed them to lower prices even further. It created this incredible self-reinforcing loop.
Right, the classic Amazon story. But didn't they just get lucky? I mean, they were already an online bookstore, and the internet was taking off. They were just in the right place at the right time.
Well, there's always an element of luck, sure. But Stanford professor Robert Bergelman had this interesting insight. He says the danger is achieving success without understanding why. Amazon didn't just ride a wave. They built the engine that propelled them forward. They understood the mechanics of their flywheel, and they ruthlessly focused on turning it.
So it's not just about having a flywheel, it's about knowing why it works.
Absolutely. Because if you don't understand the underlying principles, you can't adapt it when the landscape changes. And believe me, the landscape always changes.
And that reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, failing to capitalize on successes. So let me throw this out to our listener. Think about a time you achieved something big, right? Did you squeeze every drop of potential out of that win to propel yourself further, or did you let it just fizzle?
That's such an important point. Sometimes we get so caught up in celebrating a win that we forget to use that momentum to fuel the next one.
Yeah, and speaking of momentum, I think the example of Intel really highlights the power of a well-conceived flywheel, even when things get a little turbulent.
Yeah, you're right. Think about it. They transitioned from memory chips to microprocessors, a completely different product.
Right.
But they didn't abandon their flywheel. They kept that core structure. Design, price high, drive down costs with increased volume, reinvest profits in R&D, and then repeat. That same loop powered their dominance for decades, even through massive shifts in the tech industry.
Wow, that's incredible. So they managed to maintain momentum even when they completely changed their product. So it sounds like the big thing isn't the product itself. It's the underlying architecture of the flywheel.
That's exactly right. It's about having a system in place that consistently generates results regardless of the specific product or service you're offering.
But hold on, doesn't that sound a little bit repetitive, like you're just doing the same thing over and over again?
Well, it's not about mindlessly repeating the same actions. It's about continuously evolving and extending the core principles. Like, look at Vanguard, for example. They didn't stop with just one index fund. They created this whole suite of low-cost funds, and it was all driven by the same flywheel logic. Low cost, high volume, customer centricity.
And Amazon. They bought Whole Foods right. They extended their reach into brick and mortar retail. That's a pretty bold move for a company that built its empire online.
Absolutely. And both of those examples, Vanguard and Amazon, highlight the difference between just repeating what you've done and strategically adapting your core principles to capitalize on new opportunities.
I love that. It's about finding that sweet spot between consistency and evolution. But now I'm getting really curious about how to actually capture this magic for myself. How do I build my own flywheel? Where do I even begin?
It all starts with taking a good hard look at your own experiences. What are your biggest wins? And, just as importantly, what are your most significant disappointments?
So it's about looking for patterns in both your successes and your failures.
Precisely. What were the common elements in your wins? And what was missing in those losses?
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be a really valuable exercise. You're basically reverse engineering your own success formula.
That's a great way to put it. And once you have those insights, You can start sketching out your flywheel. What's the first step? What's the second step? How does it loop back and create that self-reinforcing momentum?
That reminds me of Deb Gustafson, the elementary school principal that you mentioned earlier. She completely turned around a failing school on a military base using a flywheel, right?
She's a perfect example. Imagine the challenges she faced. Transient student population, limited resources, low morale. But she built this really powerful flywheel. It started with attracting passionate teachers, then building collaborative teams, implementing frequent assessments of student progress, and achieving real learning for every kid. And then that led to an enhanced reputation for the school, which helped to recruit even more talented teachers. It fueled the entire cycle.
Wow, that's a powerful story. It just goes to show that this concept can work in any field, not just business. I mean, think about the Ojai Music Festival. They've got this amazing flywheel. It attracts world-class musicians, creates a condensed but really impactful program, and then it generates this really passionate reaction from the audience, which fuels their resources and builds their reputation and attracts even more top talent the next year. It's just this self-perpetuating cycle of artistic excellence.
It really is inspiring to see how the flywheel can be applied in so many different contexts. But remember, every component is critical. Think of it like a chain. If one link is weak, the entire system could break down.
So you're saying it's not enough to just have a good idea for a flywheel. You have to be really diligent about executing every step.
Absolutely. And it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You have to constantly monitor, adjust, and make sure that each component is operating at peak efficiency.
And that brings up another important point: the need to both sustain and renew the flywheel. You can't just rely on the same approach forever, can you?
Right. Like take the Cleveland Clinic, for example. They've been a leader in healthcare for decades, driven by this culture of collaboration and patient-centric care. But even they recognize the need to renew their flywheel.
So even companies with well-established flywheels need to adapt over time.
Absolutely. Dr. Toby Cosgrove, their former CEO, he understood this deeply. He was a veteran, and he had seen firsthand the power of teamwork in those high-stakes situations. And so he led the clinic in creating patient-focused institutes, emphasizing their core values while adapting to that changing healthcare landscape.
That makes sense. So how do you know when a flywheel is stalling? What are some of the warning signs?
Well, there are two primary reasons a flywheel might stall. The first is poor execution. Maybe one or more of the components aren't working as effectively as they could be.
So it could be that the flywheel itself is sound, but the execution is lacking.
Exactly. But the other reason is more fundamental. It could be that your flywheel is simply a mismatch for the current reality of your situation.
So if you're constantly having to make fundamental changes to your flywheel, it might be time to rethink the whole structure.
That's a great insight. Continuous fundamental changes are often a sign that your flywheel wasn't conceived correctly in the first place. It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole.
Okay, so we've talked about building a flywheel and sustaining it, but what about extending it, conquering new territory? Didn't Jim Collins and Morton Hansen have a really good analogy for this?
They did. It's the fire bullets then cannonballs approach from their book, Great by Choice.
Ah, yes. I love that analogy. So you're saying it's all about testing the waters before diving in head first?
Precisely. You want to gain empirical validation before making those big bets. You fire those small, low-risk bullets first, and if they hit the mark, then you launch the cannonball. A significant investment in that validated direction.
So it's like a strategic approach to experimentation. You're not just throwing things at the wall and hoping something sticks.
Exactly. You're using small experiments to gather data and validate those assumptions before committing significant resources.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So could you give me some real-world examples of companies that have successfully used this bullets and cannonballs approach to extend their flywheels?
Absolutely. Think about Apple. Their extension into smart handheld devices started with the iPod. That was a bullet that tested the waters for that new market. And once they saw the success of the iPod, they launched the cannonball, the iPhone, which revolutionized the mobile phone industry.
Right, and then the iPad, which basically created the tablet market as we know it today. That's an amazing example of how a well-placed cannonball can completely reshape an industry. But what about Amazon? Didn't they do something similar with Amazon Web Services?
They did.
Yeah.
AWS started as this internal technology platform, a bullet that solved a problem for Amazon itself. But they soon realized that it had the potential to be this massive business in its own right. So they launched it as a cannonball. And it quickly became the dominant player in the cloud computing market.
Wow, that's a great example of how an internal solution can become a major business line through strategic extension of the flywheel. But here's a question. Can you have multiple sub-flywheels within a company? Or does everything have to tie back to one main flywheel?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
And the answer is that it depends. You can certainly have multiple sub-flywheels, but they should all align with the overarching logic of the main flywheel, and they should all contribute to the overall momentum of the company.
So it's like having a series of smaller engines that are all powering the same ship.
No. Exactly. Each sub-flywheel might focus on a specific department or product line, but they all ultimately work together to drive the company forward. And that brings us to another crucial point. The importance of continuous effort and intensity in turning that flywheel. It's not a one-and-done kind of thing. You have to keep at it relentlessly and creatively over the long term.
Okay, so you're saying that complacency is the enemy of the flywheel. You can't just coast on your past successes.
That's right. Neglecting your flywheel can have disastrous consequences. In fact, Jim Collins' research on declining companies reveals this chilling pattern of how once great companies fall from grace.
Ooh, that's ominous. Tell me more.
Well, it all starts with hubris born of success. Companies achieve a certain level of success, and they start to believe that they're invincible. They stop focusing on the fundamentals that got them there in the first place.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It is. And what happens next is that they fall into an undisciplined pursuit of more. They chase every shiny object, every new trend, without any regard for whether it fits into their overall strategy.
So they abandon the flywheel that brought them success in the first place.
Sadly, yes. They start making decisions based on ego and greed rather than sound business principles. And this inevitably leads to stage 3, denial of risk and peril. They ignore the warning signs. They convince themselves that everything is fine, even as their performance starts to slip.
So they're basically living in a fantasy world.
Pretty much. And when reality finally hits, they enter stage 4, grasping for salvation. They panic, and they start making these desperate, short-sighted decisions, jumping from one fad to another, hoping to find that quick fix.
And of course, that just makes things worse.
It does, because they're not addressing those underlying problems. They're just slapping bandages on a gaping wound. And this ultimately leads to the final stage, capitulation to irrelevance or death.
Wow, that's a pretty bleak picture. But do you have any real-world examples of companies that have fallen into this trap?
Unfortunately, yes. One of the most striking examples is Circuit City. They were once a good to great company, a pioneer in the consumer electronics retail space. They had this incredible system of superstores. They offered a wide selection of products at competitive prices.
So they had a well-functioning flywheel in place.
They did. But then they made a fatal error. They stopped turning the flywheel. They neglected their core business while chasing the next big thing. They got distracted by these new technologies and trends, and they lost sight of what made them successful in the first place.
So they essentially stopped doing what got them to the top.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, they failed to recognize the potential of their CarMax extension as part of a larger flywheel.
So they had this golden opportunity to extend their success, but they missed it.
They did. Think about it. CarMax could have been their version of Apple's iPod, this game-changing extension of their core business. But instead of seeing it that way, they spun it off into a separate company.
And that ultimately led to their demise.
It did. Circuit City is a cautionary tale of what happens when you abandon the principles that brought you greatness. Instead of staying true to their core business and extending their flywheel, they entered the doom loop and met their demise.
Wow, that's a sobering thought. But enough about decline. Let's shift back to that bigger picture of building enduring greatness.
Absolutely. And the key takeaway here is this. The key is not just to build a flywheel, but to keep turning it relentlessly and creatively for years, even decades. That's how companies achieve lasting success and avoid the pitfalls of decline.
Okay, so it's a marathon, not a sprint. But I'm still wondering, what does this all mean for our listener? What's your flywheel? How will you keep it turning?
That's where the real work begins. It's time to reflect on your passions, your strengths, and the unique value you bring to the world. And then, with relentless effort and creative discipline, start turning that flywheel one step at a time. Remember, greatness isn't a destination, it's a journey. And with the flywheel effect as your guide, you have the power to build something truly remarkable. So get out there and start turning.
That's great advice. But before you rush off to build your own empire, we've got more to unpack. Stick around for part 2 of this deep dive into the fascinating world of the flywheel. We'll be back after a short break.
All right, we're back and ready to keep this flywheel spinning. So before the break, we were talking about how even companies with great flywheels, they can stumble if they take their eye off the ball.
Right. It's like you imagine you're riding a bicycle. You're cruising along, feeling the wind in your hair. But if you stop pedaling, you're going to lose momentum and eventually you'll come to a stop. And the same principle applies to the flywheel. It requires constant attention and effort to keep it spinning.
Okay, so complacency is the enemy of progress even when you have a solid system in place.
Exactly. And one of the most common mistakes that companies make is that they fail to recognize the importance of continuous improvement. They achieve a certain level of success, and then they think they've got it all figured out. So they become complacent and they stop pushing themselves to get better.
So they're resting on their laurels. Exactly. And that's when they become vulnerable to competitors who are hungry and eager to innovate. The business world is constantly evolving. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow.
So how can companies avoid falling into this trap? How can they ensure that they're constantly pushing themselves to improve and innovate?
Well, it all comes down to culture. Companies that have a culture of continuous improvement are constantly asking themselves, how can we do this better? They're not afraid to challenge the status quo. And they're always looking for ways to streamline processes, improve efficiency, and deliver more value to their customers.
So it's not just about having a good system in place, it's about having the right mindset.
That's a great way to put it. You need both the system and the mindset to achieve lasting success.
This makes me think about another point that Collins makes in the book, the difference between a good flywheel and a great flywheel. He argues that truly great flywheels are built around this core ideology, this set of values and beliefs that guide every decision the company makes.
That's such an important distinction. A good flywheel, it might generate some impressive results in the short term, but a great flywheel has the power to sustain a company for decades, even centuries.
Can you give me an example of a company that has a truly great flywheel? One that's driven by a core ideology.
Sure, absolutely. Look at Disney. Their flywheel is built around the core values of creativity, imagination, and storytelling. And those values permeate everything they do, from their theme parks and movies to their consumer products and cruise lines.
That's so true. You can really see those values reflected in every aspect of the Disney experience. But how does a company go about identifying its core ideology? Is it something you just come up with in a board meeting?
It's definitely not something you can just invent out of thin air. It has to come from within. It has to be authentic to the company's history, its culture, and its people.
So it's more about discovery than invention.
Exactly. It's about identifying those underlying principles that have always driven the company's success,
Yeah.
even if they haven't been explicitly articulated.
This reminds me of something you said earlier about the importance of understanding why your flywheel works. If you don't understand the underlying principles, you can't adapt it when the landscape changes.
That's right. And having a strong core ideology can help you navigate those changes. It gives you a compass to guide your decisions even when you're faced with uncertainty and disruption.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of having a strong core ideology, but how do you actually translate those values into concrete actions? How do you make sure that they're not just empty words on a wall?
Well, it all comes down to alignment. You need to make sure that every aspect of your business, from your hiring practices to your marketing campaigns, is aligned with your core ideology.
So it's about walking the talk.
Exactly. Your actions have to match your words. Otherwise, your employees and your customers will see right through you.
This makes me think about another point that Collins makes in the book, the importance of building a cult-like culture.
Ah, yes. That's one of the most controversial aspects of his work,
Yeah.
but it's also one of the most misunderstood.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when people hear the term cult-like, they often think of something sinister, something manipulative. But Collins isn't talking about brainwashing or coercion. He's talking about creating a culture where everyone is deeply committed to the company's mission and values.
So it's more about passion and purpose than blind obedience.
Exactly. And that kind of passion and purpose can be incredibly powerful. It can inspire employees to go above and beyond, to innovate, to take risks, and to achieve extraordinary results.
But how do you create that kind of culture? How do you get people to buy into the company's mission and values so deeply?
Well, it starts with hiring the right people.
Mm-hmm.
You need to find people who are already aligned with your core ideology, people who are passionate about what you do and believe in what you stand for.
So cultural fit is just as important as technical skills?
Absolutely. In fact, I would argue that it's even more important. You can teach someone technical skills, but you can't teach them to care.
That's a great point. But once you've hired the right people, how do you keep them engaged and motivated? How do you make sure that they don't lose that initial spark?
It's all about creating a work environment where people feel valued, respected, and challenged. You need to give them opportunities to grow, to learn, and to make a real difference.
So it's not just about paying them well, it's about giving them a sense of purpose and belonging.
Exactly. People want to feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves. They want to feel like their work matters.
This makes me think about another key element of the flywheel, the importance of feedback loops. Collins talks about the need to constantly gather information from your customers, your employees, and the market in general, and then use that information to refine and improve your flywheel.
That's such a crucial point. You know, a flywheel is not a static entity. It's this dynamic system that needs to be constantly monitored and adjusted.
So it's like a living organism that needs to adapt to its environment.
Exactly. And feedback loops are the mechanism by which it adapts. They allow you to see what's working, what's not working, and how you can make things better.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of culture, feedback loops, and continuous improvement. But what about the role of leadership in turning the flywheel?
Oh, leadership is absolutely essential. In fact, I would argue that it's the most important factor of all. The leader sets the tone for the entire organization. They're the ones who articulate the vision, inspire the team, and keep everyone focused on the mission.
So you're saying that a great leader can make all the difference in whether a flywheel succeeds or fails.
Absolutely. Think about Steve Jobs at Apple, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, or Howard Schultz at Starbucks. These were all leaders who had a clear vision, a passion for what they did, and the ability to inspire others to achieve greatness.
But what about leaders who aren't quite at that level? What about the rest of us who are just trying to build our own flywheels in our own little corners of the world?
That's a great question. And the good news is that you don't have to be this visionary genius to be an effective leader.
So what are some of the key qualities that any leader needs to cultivate in order to turn the flywheel effectively?
Well, first and foremost, you need to be a good listener. You need to be able to hear what your team is telling you, both the good and the bad.
So humility is an important quality for a leader.
Absolutely. The best leaders are the ones who are willing to admit that they don't have all the answers. They're open to feedback, and they're constantly learning and growing.
What else?
You also need to be a good communicator. You need to be able to articulate your vision clearly and concisely, and you need to be able to inspire your team to buy into that vision.
So it's about painting a picture of the future that everyone can get excited about.
Exactly. And it's not just about words. It's about your actions, your energy, and your enthusiasm.
So you're saying that leadership is as much about how you show up as it is about what you say.
Absolutely. People are more likely to follow a leader who is authentic, who's passionate, and who's committed to the mission.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the importance of culture, feedback loops, continuous improvement, and leadership. But I'm still wondering, is there a formula for building a successful flywheel? Is there like a step-by-step guide that anyone can follow?
Unfortunately, there's no magic formula. Every business is unique, and every flywheel has to be tailored to the specific circumstances of that business.
So it's not as simple as just copying what someone else has done.
It's not. You can certainly learn from others, but ultimately you have to figure out what works best for you.
But that doesn't mean we can't provide our listeners with some practical tips and strategies for building their own flywheels, right?
Absolutely not. In fact, I think that's a great place to focus our attention next. You know, we've talked a lot about the theory of the flywheel, but now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how to actually put it into practice.
I love that. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, we've explored some compelling examples and hopefully sparked some ideas for your own flywheel. But let's get practical, right? Where do we actually start building this thing?
Well, remember that self-reflection we talked about. It's not just a feel-good exercise, it's really the foundation. Think back on your successes, big or small, and pinpoint those common threads. What actions, decisions, or even mindsets were consistently present.
Got it. So step one is to mine our own experiences for those golden nuggets of what already works for us. What about the flip side, our not so shining moments?
Yeah, those are gold too, just in a different way. When things went off the rails, what was missing? Were there steps skipped, assumptions made, or resources that just weren't there? Those gaps are just as telling as the successes.
Okay, I see the value in this deep dive into our track record. But once we have those insights, how do we actually shape them into a flywheel?
That's where the sketching comes in, literally or figuratively. Start visualizing the sequence. What's the first action that sets the wheel in motion? What naturally follows from that, building momentum? And crucially, how does that final step loop back to amplify that very first one? creating that self-sustaining cycle.
I love the visual of actually drawing it out. The arrows, the loops, the whole shebang. It makes this kind of abstract concept feel a little bit more tangible.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to get messy with it. You
Well,
know your first draft isn't going to be perfect, and that's okay. The magic happens when you test it against your experience and refine it over time.
this whole process is reminding me of something you mentioned before, about the importance of knowing why your flywheel works, not just that it works. How does that play into building our own?
Yeah, that's where passion, strengths, and resources come in. Your flywheel shouldn't be just a theoretical model. It should be deeply aligned with who you are and what you're uniquely positioned to do.
Hmm.
Does it tap into your core strengths? Does it energize you, not just on paper, but in practice? And do you have the resources or a plan to get them to keep it turning?
Okay, this is making a lot of sense. So we're not just like replicating someone else's success, we're building a system that's truly tailored to us. It's almost like crafting a personal momentum machine.
Exactly. And just like any well-crafted machine, it needs fuel to run. That fuel is your dedication, your consistency, and your willingness to adapt and improve over time.
Speaking of adaptation, I'm thinking back to that fire bullets, then cannonballs approach. How does that fit into the whole flywheel concept?
Right, that's your safeguard against becoming too rigid. Even with a well-designed flywheel, you need to stay agile. Experiment, validate your assumptions before making those major commitments. Think of those bullets as smaller initiatives that test different components of your flywheel or even explore new extensions.
So it's like this built-in mechanism for innovation and evolution.
Precisely. And if a bullet hits the mark, it generates those positive results. It aligns with your overall strategy. Then you can confidently invest more resources, launch a full-fledged cannonball to accelerate growth in that direction.
I gotta say, this whole conversation has been incredibly insightful. But I have to admit, building a flywheel, even a personal one, it sounds like a lot of work.
It can be, yeah.
What would you say to someone who's feeling a little overwhelmed by all this?
I'd say remember that even the most massive flywheel starts with a single push. Don't get bogged down in trying to create the perfect plan right from the outset. Start with a small step, something actionable, and build from there.
Yeah, that's great advice. It's about progress, not perfection.
Yeah.
And you start turning that wheel. Even if it's just a little bit at first, you'll feel that momentum building, and that's what will keep you going.
Exactly. And remember, the beauty of the flywheel is that it's a self-reinforcing system. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. So even small efforts, sustained over time, can lead to those extraordinary results. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one inspiring others with your own flywheel success story.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on. So, to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and giving you some valuable tools to start building your own unstoppable momentum. Remember, greatness is a journey, not a destination. And it all starts with that first push.
Keep turning that flywheel, and who knows what you can achieve.
That's it for this deep dive into turning the flywheel. We'll catch you next time.